question is, what is better for a new deer hunter? The 243 Winchester or the 7mm 08 Remington? We're going to dive into both on this episode of Ron Spomer Outdoors. Well, back in the good old days, the old-time deer hunters used to think a fun way to introduce a new shooter to deer rifles was to put a 12 gauge or a 30-06 in her hand and let it knock them over. That's how I got started. But today we're a little smarter. Rather than start a new shooter off with a big flinch, it's probably wise to use a lighter kicking cartridge. Before we dive into these two popular rounds, one being a lot more popular than the other, I'd of course like to thank all of our subscribers and especially our Patreons. You could join us on Patreon. Just go to patreon.com, Ron Spomer Outdoors, and we'll sign you up. Good to have your support. And of course, the patrons we already have make it possible to run these videos week after week. We really appreciate it. Now, the 243 and the 7mm 08 are both cartridges based off of the 308 Winchester. They just shoot a little bit lighter bullets because they're narrower bullets. This gives them certain advantages and disadvantages, but both of them are great whitetail deer hunting cartridges, and neither of them kicks quite as hard as the 308 or the 30-06 or the 270 or this 280. There are just all kinds of popular deer cartridges that kick a lot more than these. And the idea with a new shooter is to sort of lighten the load, and make it easy. I mean, a great way to start anyone learning how to shoot a rifle is with a 22 long rifle, a rimfire, virtually no recoil. It's like shooting a BB gun. So they can really learn gun control, trigger control, and how to shoot precisely. And then I like to work them up in size. But at some point, you're going to want an effective deer taking cartridge as well. A lot of folks will use the 223 Remington and fairly successfully, but quite a few others think that's just a little bit too puny. So the next step up seems to be the 243 Winchester. But then there are a lot of guys who don't think that's quite got enough bullet weight or horsepower. That's where the 7mm 08 comes in. Now, plenty of you can argue for the 260 Remington, the 6.5 Creedmoor, the 257s of various stripes, especially the 257 Roberts. There are a lot of other great cartridges out there for starting that don't have a lot of recoil, but have been proven really effective on taking deer. But I just want to concentrate on these two in this episode because I get asked this question a lot. Should I go with the 243 or the 7mm 08? Well, here are some of the advantages and disadvantages. Practically speaking, there are a lot more ammunition options, it seems like, in 243. It's just a lot more widely available. You can get bullet sizes from about 55 grains in a varmint bullet up to 100 grains in your deer bullets. And all of them will really take deer. It just depends on your bullet placement. But in general, your deer hunters are probably going to be using a 90 to 100 grain bullet in the 243. So we're going to concentrate on the ballistics from that and the recoil in this episode. Now, the 7mm 08, although it's a great, versatile, all-around cartridge, just doesn't seem to have as many options in factory-loaded ammunition. Most brands, most manufacturers will load it, but they generally stick with 140 and 150 grain bullets. Now, I've got a Swift Sirocco here, or is it an A-frame? It's an A-frame at 160 grains, and that begins to really show the advantage of the 7mm 08 with heavier bullets, deeper penetration, and use on larger animals. So if you ever think your new shooter might want to graduate to an elk hunt, or even a moose hunt, or Africa for several of the bigger plains games animals, the 7mm 08 is the way to go. But if you're going to be shooting mainly in North America and hunting whitetails, mule deer, pronghorn, a lot of perhaps coyotes, foxes, and the smaller predators, you might be better off with that 243. And the recoil is part of the reason why. So I ran some numbers on the recoil. Got my recoil chart here in an 8-pound rifle, and I've put some other cartridges in here for a comparison so you can begin to feel it or understand it a little better. So the 243 Winchester, pushing a 100 grain bullet 3,000 feet per second in that 8-pound rifle, is going to kick at about 10.9 foot-pounds of energy coming back at a velocity of 9.4 feet per second. Now compare that to the 7mm weight with a fairly common 140 grain bullet at 2,900 feet per second. You're getting 16.5 foot-pounds of energy at 11.5 feet per second. So, yep, a little bit more, but how much more? How does that compare to what we know? So I threw a 30-06 in here, 150 grain bullet at 3,000 feet per second. There you're up to 21.7 foot-pounds. So anyone who shot a 30-06 will begin to appreciate the differences here. 13.2 feet per second on that 30-06. So you're doubling, really, the recoil out of that 243. You're not doubling the feet per second recoil velocity, but the energies are doubled. Now, if you want to go down the scale to that familiar 223 Remington, well, with a 55 grain bullet at 3,250 feet per second, that's only kicking at 3.9 foot-pounds and 5.6 feet per second. So there are your differences in there. They're fairly significant. But yeah, if you're really, really worried about recoil, I would go with the 243. But if you think your new shooter can take a little more kick initially until they get used to it, I would go with the 708 if you're thinking of upgrading in the size of animals you're eventually going to hunt. Now, what are we going to look at for ballistic performance? This may be not really necessary because both are more than capable of taking whitetails out to 300 yards, and you could even extend that maybe to 400. Certainly has been done many a time. I've done it a few times myself, but most new shooters, I think, are going to be staying inside of 200 yards. Out west here for pronghorn and mule deer, I think a few will stretch it out to 3. And again, it depends on your shooter. But I can remember taking some new young shooters out, and their first deer was taken at 300 to 350 yard range because they'd done a lot of practicing at that distance, and they were extremely calm shooters and could do the job. And the bullet certainly did it. I believe it was a 95 grain ballistic, probably this Winchester ballistic silver tip here. Yeah, that's what I remember it being. And no problem taking the deer, and the kid made a hard shot. So, wow, that's pretty effective stuff, 320 yards with a 243. So don't be afraid of that. But I think your bigger concern is going to be that recoil issue because either one of these is really going to do the job inside of 200 yards. But let's just look at some quick numbers. If we zero both of them to go no higher than 3 inches above point of aim, we're going to get a maximum point blank range. That means a dead on hold at the center of a deer's chest out to about 300 yards. You look at those 300 yard numbers in the elevation column, and it's dropping 3.72 out of the 243, and the 7mm 08 Remington is dropping 3.70. They're almost precisely identical drops. That's pretty cool. The wind deflection, I think we're going to have an advantage in that 7mm because it has a much higher ballistics coefficient bullet. Look on the top of your charts under the second one after drag function is ballistics coefficient. It's 0.379 in the 243 with a 100 grain bullet and 0.845 on that 7mm 08. That's significantly higher. So you're going to get a better wind resistance out of that longer, higher BC bullet. So let's just look down that windage chart to 300 yards, and we've got 6 inches, 6.14 out of the 708. That's a 10 mile an hour right angle wind, and it's 7.7. So yeah, 1.5 inches or so difference in the windage. Not a huge deal. Once again, these two are coming right in there. So as I say, you can look at those charts all you want and look at the energy and things and worry about it. I don't know that I would. Even the 243 is keeping more than 1,000 foot-pounds of energy out there at 300 yards. And most of us always say, well, if you got 1,000 foot-pounds of energy on a whitetail or a mule deer, that's more than enough. And I found that to be the case. Bullet placement number 1. And again, that's why we concern ourselves with recoil. If you can choose one of these cartridges that your new shooter can handle without flinching, that is the most important part. So, I think those are your options. Now, almost everyone chambers for both of these, although you will find a few more in the 243. And of course, they're both short action, so you can get a fairly light compact rifle. Now, I've got a 7mm 08 here in my right hand, and in my left hand, I've got a 243, but either one of them could be chambered for one or the other. So don't think that you're not going to find the rifles chambered for these cartridges. They are certainly out there. And you can even find a few in a 243. I mean, in a lever action. I've got buddies with 243 lever action Browning rifles, and they really love those. Single shots, break actions are pretty commonly found in break actions, especially the 243. So shop around, and I'm sure you're going to find something for your new shooter, and I'm going to wish you a lot of luck and happy shooting and happy hunting. Get them started off on the right foot. Forget that laugh a minute knocking them over stuff with a big kicking rifle. That's a lousy way to start a new shooter. You want to break them in gradually until they can really put them in there, and then they can increase the recoil and tolerate it as they go. Recoil is mostly a process of shooting it and learning how to shoot it, gradually working your way up. You don't want to start with a heavy kicker. So 243, 7mm 08, you guys get to pick them. Enjoy it. Ron Spomer signing off. Do subscribe to our channel. Really appreciate the support. Hunt honest and shoot straight.